International Organizations Privileges and Immunities Amendment Bill 2022.
This Council resumes the second reading debate on the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill 2022. Honourable Chen Chun-ying, Chairman of the Bills Committee on the Bill, will first address Council on the committee's report. Mr. Chen. Mr. Deputy, in my capacity as Chairperson of the Bills Committee of the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill 2022, I report the salient points of the deliberation of the Bills Committee. The bill seeks to amend the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Ordinance, the ordinance for short, to establish a licensing regime for virtual asset service providers VASPs and a registration regime for precious metals and stones PMS dealers. In general, members support the bill and urge the administration to strike a balance amongst regulation, market development, and compliance costs. Members have discussed about the definition of virtual asset VA under the bill. They have asked the administration if it covers non-fungible tokens, NFTs, and how the definition could cater for the latest development of the VA market. According to the administration, in most cases where an NFT merely represents a genuine digital representation of a collectible, it is unlikely to fall within the definition of VA under the bill. Even if the nature and function of the NFT meet the function of virtual asset, a person is only required to apply for a license when they engage in an activity that falls within the definition of virtual asset service. That is, automated trading services provided by centralized virtual asset exchanges. The administration points out that the bill empowers the Securities and Futures Commission, SFC, to prescribe the characteristics that constitute the definition of a virtual asset, and the Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury, SFST, to determine, either generally or in a particular case, whether any digital representational value is to be regarded as virtual asset under the ordinance. Moreover, the SFST is empowered to expand the scope of virtual asset service when necessary to cover other forms of virtual asset activities in the future. The SFC and the SFST may exercise the aforesaid powers by notice published in the Gazette, and such notices are subsidiary legislation subject to the negative vetting procedure of the LegCo. Regarding the licensing criteria of VASPs, the Bills Committee has looked into factors considered by the SFC in similar license applications when deciding whether the applicant or their responsible officers are fit and proper persons. The administration indicates that the bill sets out in detail factors to be considered by the SFC. These include their financial status or solvency, education or other qualifications or experience and reputation, character, reliability, and financial integrity, whether they have been convicted of an offense under the ordinance or under similar offenses. The SFC will publish guidelines. The standards set out in the guidelines are expected to be generally aligned with those set out in Fit and Proper Person guidelines published under Section 399 of the Securities and Futures Ordinance. In terms of promoting the development of virtual asset market in Hong Kong, the Bills Committee notes that the primary objective of the bill is to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, as well as to protect investors by providing a clear regulatory framework. The administration believes that the establishment of a regulatory regime will provide clarity to VASPs and further promote the stable and orderly development of the virtual asset sector. On the registration regime for PMS dealers, the Bills Committee and the Trade have expressed concerns about the scope of the definition of precious products and the 50% value threshold. In particular, members are concerned about the additional operational cost of the Category A registration. Dealers may inadvertently break the law, as they may not be aware of the PMS content of the products they sell, and hence unaware of the need to register. Having regard to the views of the Committee on the Trade, the administration has agreed to move the following amendments. 1. Only PMS dealers carrying out non-cash transactions at 120,000 Hong Kong dollars or above will need to be registered as Category A registrants. That means if dealers carrying out cash or non-cash transactions below 120,000 Hong Kong dollars will not be required to register. 2. The definition of precious product is to be amended to allay the concern of the trade that a specified threshold brings operational difficulties. The Bills Committee welcomes the amendments and is of the view that they meet the requirement of the Financial Task Force and the need for enforcement, risk assessment, and alleviate the burden of compliance of the trade. President, I now speak. That is the report of the Bills Committee, and I will now speak in my personal capacity. I am the chairperson of the Bills Committee. I'm happy to see that members have been working very hard and in a pragmatic way to make suggestions to address the inadequacies of the bill. And I also would like to commend the SFTB, the SFC, as well as the C&E Department and the Department of Justice. They have been open-minded in listening to our views, and they strive to improve the proposal so that they will keep the compliance cost on the trade to a minimum. One of the foci of the discussion is that, well, a balance has to be struck between regulation and the development of the market. This is a market with a huge potential. There should be assistance provided on top of regulation to make sure that there is continuous development. Another issue is a regulation. Currently, there is only regulation of a virtual asset platform. But what about derivative market point-to-point or peer-to-peer, as well as over-the-counter transactions? They are outside the purview of the bill. Virtual asset is very mature in Hong Kong. When it comes to cash flow, regulators may put in place mechanisms to be on top of the direction of the flows to track the fund. The government undertakes that from time to time they will review the development of the virtual asset market. That is necessary because they need to consider whether there is a need to expand the scope of the regulation. The other issue is that services will only be provided to professional investors, but there are concerns that this will stifle their business and is not conducive to further development. They asked the government not to exclude non-professional investors. The government indicated that for virtual asset compared to conventional financial markets, there is a higher risk and is quite speculative, so they need to strike a balance. The requirement of professional investors only is a prudent approach. I'm happy to hear from the government that upon the passage of the bill, they will consult on the details of the regulation. And in response to comments of the trade and members of the public, they may consider adding additional safeguards to allow non-professional investors to conduct transactions in licensed exchanges. Of course, the most important thing is public education. We don't want more investors to just follow the trend and blindly invest. In relation to the amendments of PMS dealers, the original proposal is that dealers of Category A registrants are mostly SMEs. A requirement to register will add to the burden of their operation. Upon reflecting their concerns, the government immediately introduced amendments that only the transactions above $120,000 are subject to requirement. Another concern is the definition of precious product, its scope, as well as the 50% value threshold. A number of members in the Bills Committee were of the view that most dealers may not know the precious metal and stone content. They may not know that they have to register. They may inadvertently break the law. The government, having considered the difficulties in enforcement as well as the compliance cost, delete this requirement. This actually is easier to enforce. The executive and the legislature plays different roles. Sometimes they will have different perspectives and different considerations. Despite that, as long as they have the good of society as their common ground, and if they actively communicate, they will be able to reach a consensus. The amendments of this bill is a good example. I appeal members to support this bill and all the amendments. I so submit.
是否有其他嘅議員想？
Does any other member wish to speak? Mr. Robert Lee. Thank you, Mr. Deputy. I speak in support of the resumption of debate on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing amendment bill 2022 to have a licensing system to reasonably regulate the service provider and also the precious metals and stones dealers. So there would be a two-tier system. Well, what the public would be most concerned about is how the balance can be struck, as Mr. Xi Jinping said on the 1st of July, that we will have to seize talents and also seize enterprises, opportunities, and so on. And therefore, we will have to assist the sector to develop the market. And I'm sure there are different stakeholders in the market who would hope that we can have an orderly and high-quality market. Recently, with regard to virtual assets markets incident, it shows that there is every need for us to regulate this market. And if investors are able to engage in transactions with in a regulated platform, that would better safeguard their interests. And by end of November, the government also published a statement on virtual assets development in Hong Kong, and they would also be introducing a regulatory system so that investors would be able to trade in virtual assets. And we have this consultation paper, and it's also announced that we're going to introduce this fund on virtual assets trading. And we would also be introducing a securitized tokens. And there is no express provision on that. These can only be sold to professional investors. But then with this restriction, we hope that after we have sorted out the details on the regulation, non-professional investors and also retail investors should also be permitted to trade. And if there is this restriction on professional investors only, then non-professional investors might have to go to the unlicensed platforms to trade, and that would only result in more damage or loss being incurred on them. And right now, we also have this restriction that certain products would only be available to professional investors, for example, for some bonds and also special investment vehicles and so on. Well, only professional investors would be permitted to trade in those products. And if VAs would also be limited to professional investors, on the one hand, that would limit the choices of the non-professional investors. On the other, that would also limit the development of the market. We also propose that there should be further thought given to the definition of VA and also the requirement to become a licensee, because for some young people, they may not have the capital to fulfill the requirement, but then they may have the professional knowledge. But then for professional investors, definition, if it's not amended, then many young investors might not be eligible. And also, well, in the process of applying for licenses, as it involves virtual assets and so on, well, some people have found it difficult to open a bank account. So, as said, we have to seize talents, we have to seize enterprises, and therefore we would have to attract both talents and enterprises to set up their bases or come to Hong Kong. And therefore, we will have to work harder to educate the investors, and both the Bureau and also the regulatory bodies would also have to work harder to do further promotion so that investors would have better understanding about the risks involved and also the details of these products. As the PMS dealers, they would be subject to the regulation by the Customs and Excise Department, and many dealers are concerned that there would be a lot of pressure and challenges. We hope that there can be an appropriate policy on this. For example, we will have to make sure that the fee to be charged on the regulation, and also a proper transitional arrangement has to be in place to ease the pressure on the sector, and also the implications should be minimized. With these, I support the resumption of reading of the bill. Next, Mr. Yim Kong, I support the amendments moved to this bill. With the passage and also implementation of this bill, we would be able to further target AML and also counter and also terrorist financing. That would also help safeguard the credibility and reputation of Hong Kong as an international financial center. At the same time, we can also protect the interests of the investors. As to how we can promote the development of the work, I have the following 4 suggestions. First, we will have to expedite innovation and also regulatory tools and means. For money laundering and also terrorist financing, the situation is evolving, and therefore we will have to move with time. And according to the Monetary Authority's report in 2022, after the passage of the bill, we will have to expedite the digitized regulation and also the use of technology, including the launching of the second lab on AML, and also the regulatory measures would also have to be updated. The banking sector and the enforcement authorities will have to work hand in hand in exchange of intelligence in order to regulate the flow of such activities or such money. And we would also have to promote the development of the sector in an orderly manner. Well, while we step up our regulation, we would also have to promote Hong Kong's virtual assets development. We will have to provide facilitation so that Hong Kong will be able to seize the advantage of its status as an international financial center. So we're going to introduce this licensing system in order to protect investors' interests. At the same time, we would also like to promote the steady development of the market so that the VA sector will be able to see sustainable development. Thirdly, we will have to step up our collaboration with the mainland authorities so that we can work hand in hand to target the money laundering activities in Hong Kong. Well, on the 15th of September 2015, the State Council issued a notice on cracking down on speculation activities in the market. And through the internet, many people are trying to target mainland residents, and they're providing services, and those would be deemed unlawful activities. And the Security Ministry also said that it would crack down on such activities. And in terms of intelligence and so on, they would be working hand in hand with the mainland enforcement agencies in order to crack down on any AML activities. Fourthly, we would also have to step up publicity so that the sector would be able to comply with the relevant requirements under the new licensing system. The customs and the customs department will be responsible for the regulation and the licensing of the dealers. So operators would also have to be told as to what they need to do in order to comply with the relevant legislation, and training would also have to be offered. These are my remarks. Thank you.
主席，
Mr. Johnny Ng. Mr. Deputy, there is rapid development of virtual assets. It has increased the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing. That's why the government has proposed the bill to put in place a licensing regime for virtual asset exchanges and to put in place a registration regime for precious metal and stone dealers. This is to reduce the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing on top of investor protection. I ask that when it comes to regulating virtual asset activities and market development, they strike a balance. I would like to declare that I have invested in virtual asset. Recently, there was a policy statement on development of virtual assets in Hong Kong. I think that when it comes to regulation of assets, it should be expanded to virtual assets. There has been a number of incidents of virtual asset exchanges going bust. I am of the opinion that the government should put in place measures to enable development of virtual asset. Members support the policy statement. They think that there should be better investment protection. Otherwise, investors will not be able to seek compensation when they're in trouble. Under the new system, VA exchanges will be subject to same requirements under anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, just like other exchanges. This will help VA SPs to build confidence. And I'm sure that this will be conducive to investor protection. VA activities are high risk, but there are some novel products and technology involved. This will bring business opportunities to the relevant trade. I'm sure that the regulatory regime for VASPs will clarify the rules of regulation, which is conducive to the stable development of the VA market. As long as there is a right balance struck, this will enhance Hong Kong's competitiveness as a whole. Regulation of digital asset is also important to national security. We need that to ensure development. We need to work with our country. There needs to be an awareness to prevent any acts that will undermine national security. Well, syndicates that engage in counter-terrorist financing or money laundering activities may make use of cryptocurrencies. We want to stop them from doing that. Hong Kong is an international financial center. The development into a VA center is the direction for us. With the support of our country, with our advantages in our location and our services, we can become an innovation and technology center. When it comes to regulation of the virtual asset market and investor protection, I think the bill is a good move. I speak to support the bill. Mr. Edmund Wong. Mr. Deputy, I speak to support the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill. There are two parts to this bill. First is virtual asset service providers. There is a licensing regime. The other part is precious metal and stone dealers. There is a registration regime. I will give you my views under these two areas. Virtual asset VA is the most popular thing these days. Most people are familiar with it. I'm not an expert. I am an accountant. I'm in a profession that is under regulation. I understand that effective regulation is conducive to attracting funds. There is the bankruptcy of FTX, causing losses of hundreds of millions of US dollars. Some people think that the incident of FTX shows the high risk involved in virtual asset. There are views saying that Hong Kong should never tap into it. I myself think that the FTX incident shows the importance of a good regulatory regime. A good regime is a protective barrier protecting investors inside. So these are my views. At the beginning of the scrutiny, I suggested that, well, professional investors are the only parties allowed to invest. I was baffled. The administration said that the trade thinks that if they only allow professional investors to invest, then some other investors will be excluded. And these investors will go to exchanges in other places, which is not ideal. Luckily, government departments and the SFC noted our views. The administration said that there will be consultation on the details of the regulation upon the passage of the bill. The SFC will take into account views expressed before they decide the scope of investors. The SFC would like to put in place regulatory regimes that would afford effective protection for investors. Regarding local parties or overseas parties actively marketing VA service, whether it will break the law under the bill. To some people, it may be draconian. I understand that the Securities and Futures Ordinance has been advocating this idea. But back in those days, the internet was not popular. A lot of people don't understand that we're going to legislate, so they might inadvertently break the law. I ask the administration to deal with these cases first with education. Hong Kong is an international financial center. We have been cooperating with the requirements of the FATF. In 2018-19, the FATF conducted a peer evaluation, a mutual evaluation on Hong Kong. It is found that Hong Kong has not put in place relevant regulatory regime for precious metal and stones dealers. That's why there is this bill. Different jurisdictions have similar regulatory systems. They take into their own situation before formulating the regime. The administration said that, if you are a PMS dealer, whether you engage in cash transactions above 120,000 or above or below, you have to register. It's just that if it's under 120,000, then you are category B registrant. A lot of members, including myself, express concern about the two categories. We think it's an over-regulation. It will add to the burden of the operation of SMEs. This is not a requirement of the FATF. The FATF is only concerned about transactions in cash that is above $15,000, which is 120,000. Luckily, the administration listened to the views of members and the trade, and they're willing to move an amendment. On top of that, for products that contain a very small PMS content, they will be excluded in terms of apparel, accessory, ornament, and other finished products. And you only need to register if you engage in transaction above 120,000. This will remove unnecessary regulation and is very important. Once again, I thank the administration for listening to us. I so submit to support the bill, and I support the amendments too.
Dr. Martinell, Mr. Deputy, Hong Kong is one of the freest economic entities. It does give us the competitive advantage, but it also carries the risk of the terrorists raising fund. Hong Kong has become a member of the FATF, and we're glad that over the past years, Hong Kong has been sparing no efforts in tackling the money laundering and terrorist financing. And I am chairman of the review committee on AML and CTF, and I'd like to make some remarks here. Mr. Deputy, according to the July risk assessment report on AML and CTF, the risk of AML and CTF is moderate to high. In order to respond to FATF's recommendation, we are amending the arrangement for PMS, precious metals and stones dealers, and also the virtual asset service providers, in order for them to bear the responsibility. I'm sure that this is really instrumental to maintaining Hong Kong's position as an international financial center. Mr. Deputy, the virtual asset trading has been prospering and thriving in recent years. And the decentralization and anonymization mean that through the layers of trading, it would boost the risk of AML and CTF. There is also an increasing trend for these kind of offenses. Over the past 8 months, the amount of money involved was $300 million, 5 times than the same period last year, a rise of 470%. So I believe that there is a need for us to regulate the virtual asset trading. In this amendment exercise, the government has not included the NFT. According to the administration, they are merely using the definition of FATF, and this is only a collectible item, and this is not a kind of virtual asset. But according to a FATF document, NFT is a very challenging area. This carries some risk of criminal element, and I hope that the administration would not neglect this particular loophole. NFT transaction exceeds $12 billion. 28 million transactions have taken place. In Q3, there has been a decrease, but still $3.4 billion transaction was involved. Some said that through the peer-to-peer NFT trading, it would be very easy for them to launder money because the platform can get in touch with other traders without disclosing the source of funding, and without the disclosure of ownership, people can exchange these virtual assets, that they can also create 2 different accounts to launder the money. And also in the NFT transactions, a lot of them are tokenized artwork. The artwork varies from people to people in terms of pricing, and many times it would be hard for people to cast any doubt, even if the artwork changes hand at high prices. These kind of peer-to-peer transaction is not included into the regulatory scope, and this is hardly justifiable. I think the administration should really do something about the money laundering and terrorist financing. As the government said in the policy statement on development of virtual assets in Hong Kong, the government said that they do have the commitment to explore this kind of development. There should be equal regulation for equal trade of equal nature, and we should really mitigate the risks associated with this kind of transaction. And we have to do something about the money laundering, the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing. NFT carries a very low threshold, and the risk of criminality is pretty high. And the government seems to be falling behind the curve in these legislative amendments, and I hope the administration would seriously consider plugging this potential loophole. With these words, I end my speech. Mr. Lai Tong Kwok. Mr. Deputy, money laundering is a very serious offense internationally. Hong Kong is an international financial center. The funding moves in and out of Hong Kong. We do have the obligation to tackle the money laundering and terrorist financing. The government acts in accordance with the recommendation of FATF and amends the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Ordinance and creates a licensing system for the VASP and also a registration system for the PMS dealers, or precious metals and stones dealers, and all the remaining legislative amendments. During the deliberations at the Bills Committee, myself and other fellow members are of the view that for the registration system for the PMS dealers, there should be some adjustment. According to the administration, there are the Category A and Category B registrants. I think the Category B registration is appropriate, and I support that. But for Category A, it is very broad in its scope, and I do have a lot of reservation. According to the bill, the traders of jewelry and precious metal will be incorporated regardless of the size of the transaction. And this will include products that do not fetch a high price, like the cultured pearl, and also the products that have very low metal content. And they will be included. And there are many traders who are selling all manner of stones and metals that are of very low value, and they have to be registered. And this is imposing the compliance burden on the small and medium-sized traders. According to the government, these SMEs take up a significant proportion of these PMS dealers. And for each transaction, it is not as high as the level required to be regulated by the FATF, and that is the cash transaction of more than $112,000. So the New People's Party members, the three of us, and Mr. Peter Shiu and Mr. Edmund Wong, requested that the administration amend the Category A registration. We put forward the amendment, and this would still fall within the recommendations of the FATF, and this will minimize the compliance burden on the part of the SMEs and the hawkers. We believe that the definition of precious product involves some 50% threshold, and this will present a lot of implementation difficulties. From the business point of view, this is creating a lot of obstacles. I am truly pleased that the administration is receptive to our proposals, and the government has agreed that for Category A registration, it will be related to the PMS dealers that are engaging in cash transaction of more than $120,000. Only in this kind of situation that will be registered. And for the definition of precious products at the 50% threshold, I will go. I do admire the administration's decision to adopt our proposal, and that will remove the compliance burden on the part of the MSMEs. Mr. Deputy, we are being pragmatic. The government officials, in particular the Customs and Excise, have been very receptive to our views, and they are really pragmatic, and we have completed our scrutiny in 3 meetings, and all the proposed amendments have been taken on board by the administration. And this is another example of cooperation between the executive and the legislature. Mr. Deputy, I support this bill, and with these words I conclude my speech.
Eunice Yong. Mr. Deputy, I speak in support of the resumption of reading of the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill 2022. Well, FATF in September 2020 published a report, and it requested that Hong Kong should amend our legislation in order to incorporate the recommendations made by FATF on this, and there are 2 areas. First, on precious metals and stones dealers, there should be regulatory regime on AML and CTF requirements, and also for virtual assets service providers, there should be a licensing system in place. With regard to VA service providers, I support that a licensing system be introduced because I've also received complaints from members of the public, and there was this demand that over the years that they've also placed assets on an online VA platform, but then it's a crypto scam, and that person was not able to get back his assets. So they were using fraudulent means to cheat people out of their money. And the person also resorted to his own resources to track the flow of the money, and he also reported the case to the police. But then he was told that because it involved multi-tier transfer of assets, and therefore the police would not be able to take up his case. So as to how we can do our regulation properly when it comes to virtual assets, and the licensing system would also be necessary. So the proposed licensing system would also involve this criteria of licensing, and the SFC would be looking at companies which have this experience, or companies that have been set up overseas, but then they have local assets. So they would be required to apply for a license. So that for VA asset providers, they would have to get a license, and there would be a person in charge, and there would also have to be at least 2 persons who are responsible for managing such assets, and also for in the process of offering such products, those who are regulated would also have to be deemed as licensed representatives. And when there are more persons in charge, and once they have the licensed representatives, then when members of the public encounter a situation whereby they've engaged in online trading, and if there are any illicit elements involved, even when they suspect that they had been treated, then they would be able to trace the whereabouts of their assets, and they would also be able to report the case to the police as to whether or not such assets would also as to whether certain assets should be classified as VA assets. Well, NFTs can be traded online and they can also be auctioned, and that would also be in line with the crypto currency definition, and they can also be transferred electronically, and they can also be stored and traded, and they can also be used as the medium of transaction accepted by the public, and therefore that should be defined as virtual assets. So once the amendment bill is passed, we will have to see if the definition should be extended, and we should also look at what product should be defined as virtual asset, because the situation is developing very rapidly, and therefore it's hard to say which product should be defined as virtual asset. But then if the definition is broader, then it would be able to cover some of the yet to come virtual assets. And as some members have said, we are also concerned about the development of the VA market. Other than seizing talents and also attracting enterprises to come to Hong Kong, and I believe that assets should also be what we are targeting at, in particular when the international community is so keen on this. Yes, there might be risk involved. That would also give rise to many investment products, and therefore the administration will have to look at how our investment sector can be properly regulated, and then they would in turn be able to attract people to invest in their products and services. In particular, that would also help uphold Hong Kong's competitiveness, because on the one hand we have to regulate them, on the other we have to maintain our competitiveness, and therefore a fine balance will have to be struck. There are virtual asset service providers. They are now required to register and be licensed. I think it's appropriate because it's about protecting our investors' well-being and their assets, so that they be able to get back their assets, and therefore I support the licensing criteria as proposed. As to the provision that the services can only be provided to professional investors, I would have some reservation about this, because non-professional investors will then be excluded, and they will not be able to invest in such products. That's not the purpose, because the financial services sector and also the investment sector would like to come up with products, and we believe that they have the professionalism and capability to explain these products and the risk involved to the investors properly. And therefore, whilst we recognize that our professionals are very professional in providing these services and products, such investment products should also be made available to more people so that they can trade in such products. And therefore, I agree that after the passage of the bill, the SFC should conduct a detailed consultation on this, so that the stakeholders and the public can be consulted on the definition of virtual assets and their definition, and who should be allowed to invest in such products. So I think there needs to be another round of consultation with regard to precious metals and stones dealers registration system. I agree. And I think the administration has already taken on board our views. So on top of the regular briefings, they've also had extra meetings with us to brief us on their concerns, as well as the international community's concerns and so on, and why they have put in place these provisions. And I think they have already made some adjustments to the amendment bill. Well, for Cat A registrants, they would be allowed to trade in transactions less than 120,000 Hong Kong dollars, and also under the definition of precious products and so on, apparels and so on have been taken out, and also for products in relation to medical and healthcare and also industrial products and so on, they have also been taken out. So for the precious products, they would not cover these products, and that would also allay some of the concerns of the traders And I've also asked the administration about this. On this occasion, why are they trying to regulate PMS dealers? So is it that there are risks for these dealers to engage in AML and CTF activities? Well, the administration told me that, such incidents have been rare and far in between, and therefore they would also have to be concerned about the SMEs' well-being, because they are already operating in a very difficult environment. In particular, in the wake of the epidemic, their operating environment is already becoming very difficult, and therefore they have to be more flexible so that these dealers will be able to do their business, and during the pandemic they can also support their own living. With these remarks, I support the passage of the bill and also the amendments. Mr. Holden Chow. Mr. Deputy, I speak in support of the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill 2022. Mr. Deputy, I would focus on virtual assets regulation. I remember, well, in the Bills Committee stage, one of the foci was that, well, of course, we need to have this amendment bill because through the regulatory regime, we would be helping the investors. And of course, at the Bills Committee meetings, I've also said that in the process of licensing, we may not be able to cover everything. And there are quite a few such VA platforms and dealers who might be located overseas. And there might be a situation whereby Hong Kong people might be investing through those platforms, and these traders or platforms might not have been licensed, and some people might try to invest in some overseas platforms. And for those who choose to invest via such overseas platforms, what kind of safeguards will be available to them? So that has been repeatedly raised at the Bills Committee and discussed. And of course, the basic responsibility of the government is that once we have the licensing system in place, we would also have to step up publicity and education with the public. We would also have to explain to the public that in accordance with the regulatory regime in Hong Kong, if you engage in trading with those dealers, then you would be protected. And if you choose to trade in overseas platforms with unauthorized dealers, then you will have some risk. And of course, they will have to weigh, well, if they do this through licensed institutions in Hong Kong, then the kind of treatment that you get when compared to trading on an overseas platform, that is not regulated, then of course there might be differences, and therefore you will have to explain very clearly to the investors. And I've repeatedly brought up that subject for discussion at the Bills Committee. Another point that I've brought up was that, when we regulate the virtual assets under this regulatory system, and of course professional investors will be able to invest on that. And of course I agree that professional investors in theory would have sufficient experience to judge. And when compared to the ordinary investing public, of course they are somewhat different. So that's from the perspective of protecting the investors. And the administration is trying to protect the small investors. But then my perspective is that well, the definition of professional investors might be something that the administration will have to think about, and it will have to evolve with time. And there should be a timely review of this. I think it's not just myself. I think others have also brought this up on an earlier occasion, because, well, you now have this threshold that an investor will have to have at least $8 million in his portfolio before he would be defined as a professional investor. But then there might be investors who might not be holding that much assets, but then he might be involved or he might be very experienced in investing in large transactions. You can always check his transaction records. So even myself and others might ask this question. So in defining what is meant by a professional investor. These factors should be taken on board. So I hope that the administration should take the opportunity to review the situation. And thirdly, I'd like to echo what Mr. Martin Liao said. Well, for virtual assets, it's changing very rapidly, and of course, many people have incurred losses. That's the reason why we have to introduce this regulatory regime. And obviously, what we can see is that NFTs have not been regulated on this occasion. They have not been included in the amendment bill, and the administration will have the duty to look into this. And you will have to consider how NFTs can be regulated in the future. And of course, I've also heard other members say that it's not just about NFTs, because in the world of virtual assets, you're seeing many new products because they are coming up very rapidly, and therefore you may have to have a more flexible mechanism in place in order to regulate them as they come along. So this is what this bill and also the mechanism will have to look at, because the situation is developing so rapidly. Well, by tomorrow we might be seeing many more new products, and therefore the administration, with the introduction of the system, you will have to continuously review the situation and enhance the system. Thank you.
議員，多謝代理主席。
Ms. Carmen Khan, thank you. I would like to declare that the organization I serve is a financial institution. This bill amends CAP 615 Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Ordinance. It proposes to put in place a licensing regime for VA service providers and a registration regime for precious metal and stones dealers. With the rapid changes in the market, we are glad to hear that the administration has announced a policy statement on development of virtual assets in Hong Kong by the Financial Services and the Treasury Bureau during the FinTech Week. Hong Kong is an international financial center. We should be open and tolerant towards organizations that engage in virtual asset activities. Virtual asset is an indispensable part of our market. The government said that they would provide a favorable operating environment for them. This bill is an important step, but not the last step. In terms of virtual assets, the government said that there will be a same activity, same risk, and same regulation principle. Regulation will be put in place to allow a sustainable development of innovation in virtual asset. At the same time, they want to maintain financial stability, to control risk, and to combat against anti-terrorist financing as well as money laundering activities. I think a very important point is whether the government is seeing eye to eye with the trade and stakeholders on these issues. Is it really the case that there will be same activity, same risk, and same regulation? I asked the government to consult the trade. When it comes to the regulatory framework of virtual asset, the government finally put in place this framework. It is a licensing regime for VA exchanges. The government said that they have issued guidelines when it comes to distribution of virtual asset. They've also pointed out that currently this service is limited only to professional investors. It's a simple line differentiating professional investors and non-professional investors. Members have also spoken about allowing other investors to participate. They said that the framework should be made clear so that exchanges and participants know what to do. The SFC in the policy statement said that, well, under the new licensing regime, There will be public consultation on opening the services to retail investments. The administration and the SFC said they will be prudent. There will be enhanced public education. We have sound financial fundamentals. We have a very robust regulatory regime. We should embrace a financial innovation. I hope the government will continue to promote the development of virtual asset markets. On different segments, there should be sustainable development so that the ecosystem will continue to grow. I speak to support the bill. Does any other member wish to speak?
If not, I now call upon the Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury to reply, then the debate will come to a close. Secretary, please. Madam Deputy, the government introduced the Anti-Money, Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill 2022 into the Council on July 6th. I'm grateful to the Bills Committee for scrutinizing the policy objectives and specific provisions of the bill, as well as many useful and feasible suggestions. This will facilitate the orderly development of the trade. I am grateful to Mr. Warnick Chen and Mr. Robert Lee, Chairman and Vice Chairman, and Mr. Yim, Mr. Wong, Mr. Ms. Yong, Mr. Chow, Ms. Khan, who just spoke in support of our amendments. The bill aims to strengthen Hong Kong's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, or AML and CTF regime, and to protect local investors in the area of virtual assets, thereby strengthening our position as an international financial center. This will bring our regime in line with the international standards set by FATF. The bill covers two parts. Number one, establishing a licensing regime for virtual asset service providers, VASPs, and B, establishing a registration regime for precious metals and stones dealers, or PMS dealers. In terms of VASPs, I understand the members, the industry, and the public are concerned about the opportunities and challenges presented by VA. In this regard, I published in October the policy statement on development of virtual assets in Hong Kong, which sets out the government's policy to develop a vibrant VA industry and ecosystem. And the licensing system for the VASP is of paramount importance. Under the new regime, the VA exchange will be required to comply with the same AML or CTF requirements as existing financial institutions. In relation to investor protection, licensed VA exchanges will have to comply with the requirements set by the SFC, including safe custody of assets, financial soundness, and avoidance of conflict of interest. In addition, a licensed VA exchange is required to submit to the SFC on a regular basis audited accounts and financial information of the exchange and its subsidiaries. The SFC also has the right to enter the business premises for inspection and investigations. This will help the licensed VA exchange to build up its status and investors' trust for it to reach out to more investors in the market. The recent volatility of the VA market reflects the fact that the regulatory regimes in other jurisdictions lacked comprehensive risk management measures, not least investor protection and financial stability. In light of the market conditions, regulators around the world are increasingly subscribing to the importance that Hong Kong places on investor protection and financial stability. Hong Kong is taking the first move to put in place a comprehensive regime which will increase the confidence of global VASPs. Members expressed concerns about NFT. In June, the FATF said that for the unique NFTs and that for collective items, they are not VAs, but the design of the NFTs is changing a lot, and the FATF is of the view that we have to look at the actual function instead of the claims of the NFT. And this arrangement is in keeping with the FATF's declaration. Now, NFT is developing very rapidly. We will monitor the situation, and we will be liaising with the other jurisdictions to manage the risks and also to seize the opportunity to promote Hong Kong as an international VA center. As regards the registration for PMS dealers, the Bills Committee has made valuable comments during the scrutiny of the bill, in particular the impact of Category A registration on SMEs. After careful consideration, we have decided to make adjustments in two areas. First, we propose that only PMS dealers with non-cash transactions of $120,000 or more will be required to register under Category A. In other words, if a dealer only conducts cash or non-cash transactions of less than $120,000, no registration is required. This amendment will reduce the burden on SMEs. Second, the definition of precious products, a product containing precious metals or precious stones, which account for 50% or more of the transaction price of the product. We appreciate the industry's concern that this 50% threshold will impose practical difficulties in their day-to-day business. We therefore propose that this be removed. The above proposed amendments can meet the FATF requirements and also meet the needs of enforcement and risk assessment and facilitate the industry's compliance and reduce their burden. President, in drafting the bill, we have been communicating with regulatory bodies and the industry. The amendments are generally supported by the various sectors, with stakeholders' concerns duly addressed. I urge members to support and pass the bill. Subject to its passage, the bill will take effect in phases in the second quarter of next year to allow sufficient time for the industry to prepare for the new requirements. Specifically, the registration regime for PMS dealers will take effect on April 1st, 2023, while the licensing regime for VASP and other amendments on AML CTF will take effect on June the 1st, 2023. Both new regimes will provide a transitional period to facilitate the industries to apply for licenses or register under the system. President, so I speak.
現在向各位
And I put the question to you that the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill 2022 be read the second time. Will those in favour please raise their hands? Those against, please raise their hands. I think the question is agreed by majority of members present. I declare the motion passed. Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Amendment Bill 2022. This council now becomes Committee of the